This is Yesterzine, the show that, thanks to production schedules, really hopes you're all safe and well in 2 months when you get to see this. We comfort ourselves by playing the highest and lowest rated titles in an old gaming magazine to see if their appeal is infectious, while also seeing what the rest of the magazine has to tell us about a time when Facebook was just your crazy uncle's name for his photo album. This week, Future Publishing are the only real games magazine's publishers in existence today, being the people responsible for every credible paper-based gaming tome on sale. By which I mean all of them except those Fortnite and Minecraft ones aimed at people probably not old enough to be playing Fortnite and Minecraft. Their first games reviewing magazine though came later than many, 1985's Amstrad Action, and it's issue 36 from September 1988 that we're leafing through today. Our Gaming Heaven is the first in a legendary series of RPGs, but do 1980s mechanics cut it in 2020? Our joint Gaming Hells comprise one for who the sound is its best feature, and one that has no sound at all. And in the cover feature, we'll see how two brothers in a bedroom spawned one of the world's most famous and enduring games publishers. But first, it's time to put on an elaborate and surely not appropriate for fighting costume, and delve into The Bard's Tale. The Bard's Tale is one of the old-school RPGs. Not the oldest school, it was beaten by the likes of Dungeon Master and Ultima, but it's The Bard's Tale that went on to become the biggest selling role-playing game of the decade. Bard's Tale is what's traditionally known as a dungeon crawler RPG, with its main focus on traversing and solving dungeons to find items you'll need for, or to get to, the final battle. The Bard's Tale includes 5 such places, one of which is technically optional, which is helpful because the clue on how to get there is missing from the manual of the C64 version. As always in these games, you start with a level 1 party, and Bard's Tale has a better excuse than most for that being the case. As its storyline explains.
Long ago, when magic still prevailed, the evil wizard Mangar the Dark threatened a small but harmonious country town called Skara Brae. Evil creatures oozed into Skara Brae and joined his shadow domain. Mangar froze the surrounding lands with a spell of eternal winter, totally isolating Skara Brae from any possible help. Then, one night, the town militiamen all disappeared. The future of Skara Brae hung in the balance, and who was left to resist? Only a handful of unproven young warriors, junior magic users, a couple of bards barely old enough to drink, and some out-of-work rogues. You are there. You are the leader of this ragtag group of freedom fighters. Luckily, you have a bard with you to sing your glories, if you survive. For this is the stuff of legends. And so, the story begins.
And this is RPG Heaven, as you get to define your entire starting party of 6 characters from a total of 8 initial classes. Which is 8 more classes than it appears to have musics. So we turn to gaming legend Chris Hulsbeck for the suitably epic music I'm sure he'd have written for the game if they'd asked him. As someone already wondering how I'm going to do a game with this kind of scope justice in the space available, and also as someone who can spend roughly 15% of their average playtime in a game like Fallout or Mass Effect before I even leave the character creator, this isn't the best news for me. For the purposes of this review, I accept a lot of defaults with my very soul screaming at me to tweak every parameter. There is actually a shortcut. If you had characters in EA's own Ultima 3 or other famous old school RPG wizardry, they could actually be imported into some versions of the Bard's Tale. The CPC is not one of those versions, however. So we dive into the game and walk out into the town of Skara Brae, where we're immediately ambushed by hobbits. As I remember, they're the good guys. Tim from The Office was one. It turns out, not in this case. So I go steaming in thinking how bad can it be, and promptly get my leader killed. In my defence, it turns out what I thought was parry attack is actually party attack, and seems to mean attack your own party. Exactly why I'd want to do that is somewhat beyond me, but it didn't help when most of the damage done to Brian the Fist was done by me. A sad end for a character with a quality name. Even now, it's very clear the mechanics of this thing have aged. All these games are games driven by numbers, and this presents them starkly and without fuss to you, devoting 3 times as much of the screen to that as it does to any view of where you might be. We download a map of the internet and restart the game. It helps less than you might expect. As does the revelation the manual I have is for the Commodore 64 version. We stumble into an inn where the bum wants more gold than we have to talk to us, and then somehow get lost in the town despite having a map. It also doesn't help that the left side of my keyboard appears to not to work in the game, so if you're planning to play on an emulator it might be impossible. Honestly, at this point I decide it's probably worth giving up. Unless you have nostalgia for this game, this is not the way to play it. But I have a better idea. Let me tell you a story. The Bard's Tale is primarily remembered for being the work of 3 people. Michael Crawford, not that one, was the driving force behind this, and after a power play at the studio very much led the second game before leaving the games industry without working on the third. Brian Fargo, the founder, developer and later famous publisher Interplay, was involved in the first 2 and led the third, while co-founder Rebecca Heinemann was responsible for a lot of the background tech that made a game of this size possible on these machines. She skipped 2 after being pushed out by Crawford, but would return for 3. The series has a legacy. After the initial trilogy was complete, Interplay released the Bard's Tale construction set, allowing anyone to make Bard's Tale-like RPGs for themselves. A playtester on that game was Fergus Urquhart, who would later work with Interplay on the first 2 Fallout games, before leaving as Interplay went down the tubes to form Obsidian Entertainment, since responsible for Fallout New Vegas and last year's superb Outer Worlds. As Interplay went under, Fargo and Heinemann both moved on too. Fargo founding In Exile Studios, where he'd produced a more action-orientated remake of The Bard's Tale in 2004. More recently, as the game hit 30 years old, they produced Bard's Tale 4 for Windows and the popular home consoles. Crawford returned to assist on that project. They also helped release a remastered version of the trilogy very recently, along with Rebecca Heinemann's new company, Old School. It's this version you should play. They fixed bugs, updated the graphics, and smoothed out some of the wildly different progression between different games or even different versions of the same game in the original trilogy. They added features like auto mapping, which pretty much got me to buy the thing to take a look on its own. And this is more like it. There's colour and music and stuff, which means it's time for the confession that the story overlay I used earlier while our narrator was speaking was from this version. The voice, though, was from James O'Grady, the man they should have hired in the first place. Look, it's telling me what to press. Such luxury! Unlike the CPC version, which, no kidding, uses I to mean move forward. It's got tips. Its subtle hint to check out the Scarlet Bard is actually where the first dungeon is hidden. The original version merely tells you in the manual about the one pub with wine, which is the clue they missed out of the Commodore 64's manual. Oh god, the character creator is better. Somehow, I confine myself to just creating the 2 obligatory characters, and we venture out into the town, where there's an actual tutorial. We find our way to the shop, where we outfit ourselves with some actual equipment for a dust-up, including a war axe for your mum, something I'd make a joke about if there wasn't one later in the episode. We go looking for a fight and find some orcs, where we discover that they have at least moved the Civil War option down the menu. Using our options, including the Bard's Song, we see them off. At this point, since this isn't a show about PC games, I choose to leave it. But if proper Dungeons & Dragons mechanics are your thing, play this version, not the old one. Even if you enjoyed it on CPC back in the day, it's just aged so very badly to recommend when this lovely and still authentic version is available. It even got a release last year for the Xbox One, after both In Exile and Obsidian were acquired by Microsoft. What price a new construction set? These days, development houses are huge. Consider the recent series on Distinctive Software Inc., now known after 30 years as EA Vancouver, and covered in feature-length detail during our off-season. They were started by two blokes out of uni and went on to become one of the world's biggest developers, creating series like Test Drive, Need for Speed and FIFA. And that's a fairly comprehensive spoiler for that series if you've not got round to it yet. It's a difficult transition from one or two man band 1980s effort to the giant mega complexes of today's biggest developers, and very few survived the transition intact. DSi were one, EA themselves could be argued to be another, but after that and perhaps Activision, the candidates get thinner very quickly. Offhand, I can only think of one British example whose founders are profiled in this very issue, a then 2-year-old company founded by brothers Richard and David Darling and known since the start as Codemasters. Despite still being teenagers at the time, Codemasters was already the Darlings' third software company. Although British, they had, in a useful piece of joined-up narration, grown up in Vancouver, also home to Matrick and Sember, founders of DSi. There, along with school friend Michael Hybert, they founded Darbert, and used the Hybert family VIC-20 to learn their art and produce some copyright-wobbly versions of Defender and Galaxian. Moving back to the UK, they got their own VIC-20 and sold games under the name Galactic Software. This led to a contract with legendary budget publishers Mastertronic, and they produced a string of high-profile budget games, including this, BMX Racers. They smartly used their money to buy a stake in Mastertronic itself, and in 1986 they were able to use selling that stake to fund going independent, founding Codemasters in October that year. The new Codemasters did not stray far from the tree, producing as their first game a sequel to BMX Racers, establishing a long-running Codemasters brand with BMX Simulator. The strategy at Codemasters was to release the best games they could at budget prices and to become something of a ubiquitous name. It was identical to their strategy at Mastertronic, and in the mid-80s it worked a treat. Codis became big enough to hire people both to make new games and port their existing ones to other 8-bit formats. One, or rather two of those people, were the Oliver twins, who had just released their most famous title Dizzy and its follow-up Treasure Island Dizzy, as we joined them and the Darling brothers in a big interview in Amstrad Action this month. Inevitably, by this point, the brothers were finding time a problem. Richard mentions that he hasn't worked on a game directly since he finished the BMX sequel Pro BMX 6 months earlier. Their time was taken up in great part with dealing with their army of 200 part-time freelancers, each commissioned according to availability and the needs of the product. Codemasters' willingness to work with these authors meant they were getting sent a lot of demos and portfolios, including 2 to 3 complete games a day. Richard speaks.
Unfortunately, most of the games we get sent, even if they try and send them to us as a finished product, we can only use it as a demo of their ability. Probably half are a waste of time, but it's very unfair. Most of them are as good as the first games we sold in 1982 to 83. Most of them are up to that standard, but nowadays the standard is so much higher that it's very difficult for anyone to break into it.
Freelancer Mike Clark observes that most of the programmers are around their age rather than older or even younger. Richard has a theory.
That's the age group that could go from nothing to writing something that was publishable in 6 months, which isn't too big a slide of time. But nowadays, for someone of the same ability, it would take a couple of years, because there's just so much experience about. I don't think there's any less ability.
It's interesting they're already worried about the industry's barrier to entry, that it was already difficult to get exposure. We're not long from the appearance of public domain or PD libraries, which help people distribute games for free, and we'll look at them another day. Now, of course, the internet creates the opposite problem, where anyone can distribute anything, but most of it is bobbins. And the trick is standing out. Codemasters' heavy use of freelancers over full-time staff comes under scrutiny. AA asks how they retain staff under that model. Richard points out that as programmers, not only do they communicate well with these people, they can also spot how much work, if any, a game is going to need to be commercially viable. They were also able to offer considerable technical support. Richard again.
In other companies, you have someone employed as a software acquisition manager, and they haven't programmed. You see, it can work both ways. The programmer can trick the company by saying, "Oh no, that's impossible." And the company can inadvertently be very cruel to the programmers by saying, "We need this changing," when it's only a very minor difference, but it will take 3 weeks' work to do it.
Mike explained from the developer's side.
And also the thing that kept me coming back is the deal Codemasters offered. I was a programmer, wrote 5 games, sold them all to Codemasters, and then I looked around and couldn't get a better deal.
David explains why they don't like in-house programmers.
In-house programmers are a problem in some ways, I think. The incentives are all wrong. They're being paid full-time and don't necessarily have the right motivation to achieve the same goals to get a thing finished and ready for marketing.
It's not all a winner. There's a section which AA felt the need to highlight in a box about girls playing computer games. And it's dated about as well as you'd imagine. The article is a mine of cringe, but let's let Richard dig the grave on this one.
This game here, Superhero, I think it's very good and I think our audience will like it, but it is a man walking around a fantasy world doing abstract things. Girls are more down to earth and they just don't see any point.
Because, you know, there's no way a series about fantastical superheroes is ever going to achieve cross-gender appeal, is there? We leave the darlings to think about what they've done at this point. The interview moves on to their newest signings, the Olivers deep into working on their 3rd Dizzy game. They came to Codemasters having been ripped off by 2 separate publishers over 2 separate games. They were shopping their next game, Super Robin Hood, around and not getting very far with it, claiming to have been laughed out of Mastertronic's office with it before meeting Richard and David at a computer show. Codemasters released Super Robin Hood with an advance royalty of £10,000, expecting to sell 10 times that in copies. It worked. The Olivers and Codemasters would be largely inseparable for the next 5 years, and in Dizzy created one of the iconic characters of early gaming. It's a different world. Philip mentions they essentially finished Super Robin Hood in a month between them. Unimaginable for anything commercial these days. Another example of how different a world it is can be found in Andrew's lament about the increasing complexity of games.
There's more memory, more graphics. In most cases, you've got to get in an artist because the programmer can't do it all.
An artist. Such unimaginable spending on development. A whole artist. AA asked if they can do a game in a month, did they ever want to spend 6 months writing something on the scale of, say, Elite? Andrew and Philip are pretty clear.
Nah, boring.
The more games we release, the more we sell. If people buy one and like it, they'll want to buy more games we write.
On the front of Jet Bike Simulator, it said, "By the famous Oliver twins." Now, all the mail we get at Codemasters is addressed to the famous Oliver twins.
We got one the other day to the fairly well-known Oliver twins.
The Oliver twins label sells games.
The interview closes by asking the twins what they want to be doing in 5 years. Andrew answers.
There's no reason why we shouldn't still be doing this. People will still be buying games, we'll still be selling them.
They were right. The Olivers are still in gaming, having founded both Blitz Games and later a company called Radiant Worlds, which is now part of Rebellion. Codemasters didn't stay a budget publisher. Even by 1988 they were experimenting with mid-price games where the game justified it. And by the time the 16-bit consoles rolled around, they were a fully fledged publisher with a much more standard internal development model. It was about now the world discovered Codemasters. Maybe you have the Game Genie cheat device, which deserves a feature of its own, and will no doubt get one. But if you didn't, there's every chance you played this. Micro Machines was the standout social game of the generation. Micro Machines 2 took that and ran with it. The simple controls of the top-down racer, combined with an innovative Mega Drive cartridge that had 2 controller ports right there in the cartridge itself, meant that by sharing joypads, an utterly chaotic 8 players could play at once on a single system around a single TV. It's a trick that the move to CDs lost to time for 2 decades, and only recently has it re-emerged. Nintendo have made much of the Switch's ability for each player to take half a Joy-Con and each play a game of Mario Kart or Virtua Racing. But it's not their invention, it's Codemasters. What's old is new again. In the late 90s they found another niche, producing a series of well-regarded music creation, let's still call them games, for the PlayStation, in the form of Music 2000 and the MTV Music Generator series, along with Jester Interactive. But today you know them as a driving game publisher, to the extent that for a while they were all but completely rebranded as Codemasters Racing. And it all began with two of the legendary racing games of the PlayStation era. If you ask people to name a PlayStation racing game, then, well, they'll say Gran Turismo. But if you ask them to name a second, then it's odds on they'll name one of these two. TOCA Touring Cars, based on the British Touring Car Championship during its golden age of manufacturer involvement. And if it's not that, then it's Colin McRae Rally, licensed from the legendary British Rally World Champion. TOCA morphed into Race Driver and later Grid. Colin McRae into Colin McRae Dirt, and then, after the death of Colin McRae in 2007, simply Dirt. Both series had new games as late as last year with the reboot of Grid and the second Dirt Rally game, which is one hell of a VR experience. By this point the darlings were gone too, of course. They sold out in 2007, mostly to Chinese mega conglomerate Reliance, who you'll know from music, games and films, most notably a large stake in DreamWorks Pictures. They took the company public and now own 29%. The darlings were awarded a CBE in 2008, and only David has stayed in the games industry. In 2011, after a suitable break, he founded mobile developer and now publisher Quali. After a few embarrassing marketing missteps, including calling a game Pussy Flip and an edgy video where they destroyed an iPad for a joke, Quali have established themselves as one of the more together companies in the world of publishing crappy cash grab mobile freemium bullshit. It proved needed that things come full circle. Quali now do not develop much themselves, but do advertise heavily for developers to submit their own games for consideration. They say you can't go back, but just maybe, David Darling might have found a way to be exactly where he was 32 years ago. The loser in this issue, with 28%, is Psycho Pigs. This is immediately interesting to me because it comes with a very good pedigree. The publisher is US Gold, who you saw last issue delivering some very high quality conversions to the Master System. The developer is Software Creations, responsible for the very much better of the two Indiana Jones games we mentioned, as well as a number of good conversions over the years of various arcade games. And even some original stuff, such as the Pickford Brothers' rather excellent platformer Plock, which impressed Mario creator Shigeru Miyamoto so much he wanted Nintendo to publish it. So a 28% game buried 46 pages deep in Amstrad action is not where we expected to end up. So what's going on here? You've not heard of Psycho Pigs, I suspect, neither had I. But that's because they renamed it. This is actually an arcade conversion of a Japanese-only arcade game called Butasan from the previous year. It too has good lineage. It's by Jaleco, responsible for any number of fondly remembered titles, most notably for me the arcade racer Big Run. But chances are if you had Nintendo consoles, you'll have seen their logo at least once. Amstrad Action either didn't realise or didn't mention this was a conversion. Understandable given it was a Japanese-only title. But that means it needs to stand on its own merits without the residual affection for the arcade game. Psycho Pigs is, essentially, a simpler version of Bomberman. You run around the levels as a pig, picking up bombs and throwing them. Bombs have numbers on them, which represents a countdown that'll begin when you chuck it, but a direct hit will cause an immediate explosion. Already you realise that multiplayer, as with Bomberman, would be excellent. This CPC version does indeed support 2 players, but imagine 8-player online if they did a new remake. The pigs claim to have distinct personalities, but you don't really notice this in the major panic of a busy round, and they really are busy. This puts a lot of pigs and bombs on the screen, and it moves really quickly. Combine that with the fact that bombs can set off other bombs, and you can cause some pretty huge explosions. Despite that, it's not actually that difficult a game. You get multiple lives and your enemies do not, which means I was managing very easy runs quite deep into the game. Certainly past some of the whack-a-mole style bonus levels to let you get some bonus points. It's not smooth sailing. While it's colourful, it's also a bit smudgy and confusing at this resolution, and I pity anyone with a green screen CPC who picked this one up. It's also a little trickier than I'd like to throw a bomb diagonally, a vital trick. It also commits a surprisingly common crime I maintain should probably qualify for the death penalty. It makes me enter a high score, arcade style, with the joystick. I am on a computer. I have a keyboard for doing a typings. This is not why it got 28% though. Perhaps because US Gold saw it as a much bigger name arcade conversion than it perhaps was, Psycho Pigs is a full price game. That means £10 on tape, and an eye-watering for the time £15 for the disc version we've been playing here. And that's steep for a throwaway game that stands very much more alongside the likes of Mastertronic or Codemasters budget offerings than something like, say, The Bard's Tale. We said this before though, it's 2020. We're not paying for any of these unless we're picking up eBay copies. We don't care if this launched for £2, £10 or £200 originally if we can get hold of a copy. And with that in mind, I think they're well underscored for this game today. I don't know if this is the version you want to play because it's got several conversions. You can play it on the Spectrum, C64, MSX, the Japanese only X68000, and one more machine, the PlayStation 4. No, seriously. Hamster Corporation's Arcade Archive series brought a perfect recreation of the original co-op to PS4 in 2015 back under the name Buta-san, and it looks great. Unfortunately, being a direct conversion, it's still limited to 2 players. But if you've got £6 credit sitting around, this is your best bet. And you know what? You could do a lot worse with that money. Which means we need another option for our gaming hell. And just 1% higher reviewed, one does present itself. Much like Psycho Pigs, Stunt Bike Simulator also has something of a pedigree. Despite the name, it's not actually a Codemasters game. It's by Probe, who were incredibly prolific as a developer. They released 11 games in 1988 alone. They were conversion specialists. Just to pick out some examples, they converted Outrun Europa to computers and consoles for US Gold and Sega. If you played Mortal Kombat, there's a very good chance they did that port. The Master System version of Road Rash we saw last issue was theirs. Die Hard Trilogy was theirs. Their last major game was the fondly remembered racing game Revolt on all systems. They even converted some FIFA games. The publisher was Silverbird, related to Rainbird and Firebird, and owned by, of all people, British Telecom. The next year they'd be acquired by Microprose. They too produced some good stuff, but the one you'll remember on most formats is a little game called Elite. Silverbird was the budget label of the lineup, and Stunt Bike, named after your mum's job title, was a cheapie, costing only $1.99. It's possibly unfortunate for it that, as we just mentioned, we don't care. So let's look at the game on its own merits, and the first merit is the sound. It has none. At all. Did people think the CPC couldn't do music or something? Again, we turn to Chris Hulsbeck. Ah, lovely. It's a short game. There's 5 stunts in total, of which I've managed to play 3 even in my short time with the game. You start with the hang glider stunt, where you have to drop from the glider and land on the bike. Confusingly, you control the bike, which is somehow staying upright despite a complete lack of rider, and have no control over the hang glider you are literally attached to. It's also awkward. Without sound and no number-based visual indicator, it's very difficult to know how quick you're going, meaning you frequently drop behind or in front of the bike. Especially as the glider seems to near randomly vary its speed too, despite, again, being the thing you should be controlling. You have to hold down keys to move too, so it does not respond especially quickly. Clear this and it gets more frustrating. The reason for holding down keys becomes clear in the log jumping, which is actually log bunny hopping. You have to hold down fire and press up, then down quickly as you go over the log, which is really tricky to pull off. The game's manual even advises you to just avoid the logs if you can, which suggests they knew they got this one wrong. Hitting anything, including the almost cruelly prolific cracks in the road, causes a tumble, a loss of speed, and crucially, points off your score for the round, and if that hits 0, it's game over. Still, get through that and you're on to the fire rings, a stunt which basically combines the frustrations of the previous two. There are still more holes in the road than a Buckinghamshire A road to avoid, but also you now jump off the bike and through the hoops, meaning you're back to attempting to precisely judge the speed in order to land back on the bike, as in the first stunt. If you were to move on from this, you'd encounter lorry catching, where again you avoid the holes to catch up and board a truck, and then the exact reverse of the first one where you leap off the bike onto a helicopter. And that's it. As AA points out, the first stunt is possibly the hardest in the game, so I suspect if I could be minded to spend a full day at this, I could even complete it. I don't want to though. At least it was fairly priced. I've played a lot worse from £2 budget labels. But in 2020, this is not what you want to play, even in a genre that's not super crowded. Amstrad Action were, to my mind, harsh, even with a game entirely without sound, but it's also not remotely doing enough to save itself from deserved obscurity. On the back page, we take our usual joined up thinking and recommend rose-tinted Spectrum, a YouTube channel of incredibly knowledgeable, good-hearted and nostalgia-filled reviews of mostly Spectrum games. There's little on YouTube this engaging and lovely, even when he's angry. If you want a great time, may we suggest you continue this episode's theme and sample his long look at Treasure Island Dizzy.
Dizzy was a great friend. But then a dark cloud looms overhead. What about that time he dropped a cage on you and you couldn't possibly know about it? That was annoying.
Or his case for the Spectrum version of Midnight Resistance being the correct one.
There's a good reason why Ocean's name was often a sign of quality on the ZX Spectrum. Batman, Bruce Lee, Chase HQ, Daley Thompson, New Zealand Story. Honestly, I could just spend an entire video reading names of Ocean games. It seems if anyone could do it, Ocean could. So who on earth would be able to port a respectable version of Midnight Resistance from the arcade to the homely ZX Spectrum? It's an easy one. I've just given you the answer. It's Ocean. That's what it's Ocean.
Or for 16-bit, how Ocean took the delicate pathos of mental illness exploration in Lethal Weapon, and then remembered they were Ocean and made a platform shooter.
You could literally paint any theme over the top of this game, call it something else, and it would play exactly the same.
As fans of both scripted series and reasonable production values, it's right up our street. Join us, won't you? And that's our show. Do the YouTube things and make a note to be back here in 1 week's time when we'll open another period magazine and mine the treasure within. Hopefully, treasure that actually has sound. Toodles!